So we're here to work on this economic argument presented by Matheson and Baade that's in your content folder for week 7. And the big argument here is, should New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, rebuild the Superdome, invest precious resources into the Superdome, or should they invest those resources for recovery in other areas? So Matheson and Baade are economists who are writing just 6 months or so after Katrina has hit, and when New Orleans is still digging out, still drying out from this terrible calamity. And so they are economists using all the data they have at their disposal to try to argue one way or the other, should we rebuild the Superdome? We've been talking about these ideas of great arenas in cities that people want. We talked about it from the very first day with the Entrust Arena, right? And some of you are working on, for your final projects, these ideas of what do the Kansas City Royals bring to Kansas City? What do the Wingnuts bring to Wichita? Right? So that's the idea. What do these professional sports spectacular venues bring to a city? And should a city invest in such venues, and how should they invest in them? So Matheson and Baade are taking the opportunity of taking a look at New Orleans sort of rebuilding itself from the ground up and revisiting the idea, as we did in Wichita several years ago, how much money should we invest in these large arenas, in these large professional sports venues for the sake of the city? Their argument ultimately comes down to, if you can achieve a return on your investment economically, if you can actually see economic benefit to your city from the creation, from the investment of such a great facility, then by all means do it. But if you can't see a return on it, if you eventually can't see it paying for itself in some fashion, whether it's in tourist dollars, revenue for people, enhancing the quality of life, you'll see in the Horrocks argument coming up as well. Can you enhance the quality of life in a city? Can you bring jobs to the city? Can you somehow make life great in the city through this investment? Then you really just shouldn't do it, right? So that's what we're talking about with regard to this essay. So Matheson and Baade, just to give you a little background. Some of you know, some of you will recall, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in August 29, 2005. You probably know that much of the city of New Orleans is below sea level, and that in order to protect the city of New Orleans from flooding during hurricane season, we have a series of levees that sort of hold back the water both from the sea and from the Mississippi River, which New Orleans is right on. And then we also have a series of pumps working through the city 24/7 most of the year that are actually pumping water out of low-lying areas back into the Gulf of Mexico, back into the Mississippi River. So New Orleans has geographic issues, first and foremost, that make it prone to flooding. And during hurricane season, this is particularly bad. And so you were barely alive, some of you are closer to my age, and so you remember the devastation of Katrina. But geographically, New Orleans has some issues there. Matheson and Baade write their assessment in February of 2006, and that's what you have. So they have only, right, about 6 months, if you will, after the fact, while the city of New Orleans, while the state of Louisiana, and also the country is trying to decide, what do we do to recover New Orleans? Do we rebuild New Orleans? What do we do? Just to give you some understanding, we currently believe, at least by last count, that the number of lives lost to Katrina was over 1,464. There are a lot of people that are still unaccounted for, and a lot of the names still not released because families have not been found to be notified. So there's a lot of ambiguity in those numbers. The economic cost, again, this was assessed just last year, somewhere around $128 billion. Matheson and Baade will give you figures, but please know that they are just 6 months out. There is still a lot to know, but most recent calculations put the loss at $128 billion. You compare that to Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, that hit the Northeast not too long ago. That's much more in recent memory for all of us. There were 159 lives lost at this counting currently, and the economic cost to New Jersey, New York, the states of New Jersey, New York City, other areas, Connecticut along the eastern seaboard, the economic cost more than $50 billion. So that's a little closer in recent memory for us, and maybe a nice point to compare. Not that any life lost is up for comparison, right? We're not meaning to do that. But Katrina, to give it a little perspective, really took a toll on that community in Louisiana and other places, certainly Alabama, Florida, but absolutely took a big hit in this community. All right, let me move this along and we'll get to the image of the Superdome, which some of you have already seen. So Matheson and Baade are asking the question, what's the role of such great facilities in our community, and what should we do to revitalize them? And where should we start, right? Where should we begin revitalizing New Orleans after this terrible event, right? Let me get a light off so we can take a little better look at that image. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to go from my notes, and I hope you've already read the Matheson and Baade argument. There's a lot of economic issues for those of you who are business majors or who are interested in some of the more interesting economic aspects of these events you're covering, these traditions, these venues you're covering. Matheson and Baade can give you sort of a place to start. So we've already talked a little bit about how what Matheson and Baade start with is to tell you a little bit about the devastation and the elements, the limits of the great destruction that happened. We've talked a little bit about that already. Following the devastation of Katrina, the first thing that Matheson and Baade say has to be addressed is the infrastructure of the city, right? The levees that hold back the water, the highways, and then housing. 80% of the housing in New Orleans was damaged by this storm, 80%. That's extraordinary, right? If you can only imagine, again, the population of New Orleans is very similar to the population of Wichita. The population of New Orleans before Katrina, around 450,000. Latest tallies suggest that only about 350,000 people returned after Hurricane Katrina, so they actually lost some population in the long run there. So about the size of Wichita. Imagine, if you will, 80% of the housing in Wichita devastated in some fashion, damaged in some fashion, maybe devastated is the wrong word, but damaged in some fashion due to a great storm of this nature. We are familiar with tornadoes here, and we know that something like this absolutely could happen to us. So 80% of the housing damaged. In particular, Matheson and Baade are going to talk to you about the middle class in New Orleans, that they believe that the middle class is key to the issue of what do we do, how do we rebuild in New Orleans. And they're key in terms of production, in terms of wage earning, and in terms of consumption, right? So the middle class has, typically in our country, more disposable income than the lower classes, the working class. And there's more of them than the higher class, if you want to call them the corporate rich, if you want to go that way, whatever your definition would be. But people who make significant amounts of money, you know, in millions, then the middle class is numerous, and the middle class has purchasing power. And so he talks about them. They're going to need support if they're going to come back. In particular, he's going to talk about, again, the idea that the middle class is going to need housing, the middle class is going to need schools, the middle class is going to need highways, places to go and work, and they need to be able to count on the water supply. And so if you want to attract a flourishing middle class, you've got to have those people need confidence that they can raise their children here, because they do indeed have options. They can go other places, right? Oftentimes the lower classes in society may not have as many options as the middle class. And while we certainly have lower class folks living in New Orleans, it is the middle class that Matheson and Baade are most concerned about. So if you take a look at your article, you'll see that they're including lots of charts. And in particular, they're concerned that in New Orleans before Katrina, that we had higher unemployment rates in New Orleans than other places in the country, than most places in the country, the average. We have lower education levels in New Orleans than in the rest of the country. We have higher rates of poverty in New Orleans on average than in other places in the country. So these economists are very worried that in trying to rebuild New Orleans, we've got to really think about who lives here and what their purchasing power is like, but also what kind of city services they're going to need to thrive and bring New Orleans back. He'll go through and he'll say that Katrina hit the economically disadvantaged the hardest, right? That means the people who have who rely upon public transportation to get to work, say, right? People who want neighborhood schools because they can get their kids close. They can easily get their kids to school. So the neighborhood schools in the Ninth Ward, public transportation in the Ninth Ward, which is a huge area in New Orleans that supports where a lot of lower income folk live, that those areas were the hardest hit. He says 45% of the people displaced by Hurricane Katrina don't own their own homes or did not own their own homes. So 45% of those displaced by Katrina don't own their own homes. What this means is that it's easier to leave. It's easier to move, right? So Matheson and Baade are really concerned that once people leave New Orleans, while they're waiting for New Orleans to be rebuilt, they just won't come back again. And if you don't have a population base in your city, what is that going to do for your tax revenues? What is that going to do for your infrastructure if you can't rebuild your city? He also is worried that the devastation caused by Katrina is going to wipe out community loyalty, that people who have been born and raised in New Orleans and who may not have, who want to live there because they like the culture, they like the community, they have loyalty for the community and for their neighbors, right? If we can't rebuild, if we can't reconnect those people in their communities, they may lose that sense of loyalty to the city. So that sort of emotional connection might be lost as well. So getting it back to his theme, if you have a smaller middle class, a smaller lower class, people who are economically displaced, who've been forced to leave their homes and locate elsewhere. You probably know a lot of people located in Houston, a lot of people went to northern parts of Louisiana, but Texas got a great influx of people. Mississippi probably too, but Texas just a little closer, more facilities, higher ground. That basically, if those folks get there, they didn't have a house to go back to. They didn't own that house. It would be easier to start a new economic life in, say, Texas, easier to put down roots there, and just don't even come back. So a smaller population in New Orleans would be a real problem for bringing back the Superdome, for bringing back great sports venues. The next section he goes into is he talks about what I'm calling, or he's calling, a blueprint for redevelopment and the role of the leisure industry in redevelopment of New Orleans. So once this pair have sort of set out, here's the problem that we're confronting, right? Great devastation, lack of confidence in our infrastructure, lack of funding for our infrastructure. The middle class is leaving, the lower classes are leaving. Will they come back? Some people don't have much to hold them here, right? Will they come back? He says the next thing we have to do is how are we going to redevelop? Because they're assuming that we're going to rebuild New Orleans, that we're not just going to leave it as a devastation. And he says two big issues in New Orleans for growth are important, and that's tourism and water transport. These are key industries for New Orleans. New Orleans is a great port, one of the huge ports in our country, right? There's Houston, there's New York, there's San Francisco, there's LA, and New Orleans, great port, that great Mississippi River. You can bring things from the interior of the country by water transport. You can bring things from overseas through the Gulf. So a very important industry for New Orleans. The other thing is that the French Quarter, which is traditionally the the draw for tourism is on high ground. So the French Quarter did not suffer horribly because of Katrina. They had flooding, to be sure. And I was recently in New Orleans, and you could see the water lines on some of the buildings there. But the flooding was short, and it wasn't of long duration. For those of you who know Katrina, you know that the flood waters took weeks to recede. And that just creates impossible damage to overcome. You can't have your house underwater for weeks. It's unlivable. There's no recovering for it. So the French Quarter did not suffer as much as other places, and tourism for the French Quarter is a big draw. Previous to Katrina, New Orleans attracted some 10 million visitors each year who spent on average $5 billion. So that's about $500 per person, right? So 10 million a year with a total spending of $5 billion. So that's huge. So the recipe, according to Matheson and Baade, is rebuild the infrastructure for the middle class, get them back in. You need to rebuild the infrastructure for the middle class because they are involved in tourism. They are involved in businesses that cater to tourism. They are also involved in businesses that are associated with the great transport, for the great hub, the commercial hub that New Orleans is for trade and transport. So if you replace the infrastructure for the middle class, if you replace the infrastructure, again, schools, roads, electricity, communication, running cables for internet, for entertainment purposes, cable TV, satellites, whatever it is that you need, right? If you can do that, then you can get going. One of the issues here, if I can find it, sorry, that he then goes into on his page 9, getting back to our idea of rebuilding for sports, right? He says on page 9, if you can get this infrastructure back, if you can get your middle class back, he says that you can then start to see some economic benefit from recovering in restoring sports, right? In restoring these mega venues. Then he says, if you can replace the infrastructure for the middle class, then you can replace the infrastructure for these great sporting events. Finally, he says, if you pull together a cost-benefit analysis and you think about what is it going to cost to get this going, if the benefits to the community for investing in mega sports facilities, in the Superdome, in all of the events associated with that, right? If you can assess what that's going to cost, and then also assess what kind of revenue then can you expect? What will be your return on investment, your ROI, right? What will be your return on investment once you make this grand investment into the Superdome? Will the money come back to the community and support growth in the community through jobs creation, through tourism, through what other ancillary economic activities you can think of, hotels, restaurants, etc., right? So can you assess the damage that we have? Can you assess the infrastructure recreation that we will have to do? Can you then talk about what it's going to take to rebuild the Superdome? And if you do all of that, will the investment that you put into it ever be recovered? So that's the issue that he's getting at. Yeah? So let's take a break here and we'll come back and see how he does.